On a crisp autumn evening, the city glowed with golden lights that danced on the wet pavement after a gentle rain. Expensive cars purred down the boulevard and the hum of life filled the night air. Inside an upscale restaurant where the chandeliers sparkled like captured stars, a billionaire named Adrian Kane waited at a corner table near the window. Known for his success in tech and his impeccable taste in everything, from the suits he wore to the vintage wines he collected, Adrian rarely found himself nervous. But that night, for reasons he couldn't quite explain, he felt the quickened heartbeat of anticipation. He had agreed to this blind date reluctantly. A mutual friend had insisted that he meet someone special, genuine, unlike anyone you've met before. He had smiled politely, expecting the usual, someone drawn by his fortune, someone dazzled by the life his wealth could offer, the kind of meeting he had endured countless times before. That was why he wore his most understated gray suit instead of the usual black tuxedo, hoping to keep things casual, even ordinary. At 7:30 sharp, the restaurant doors opened and a young woman stepped in. She looked around uncertainly, clutching a small purse. Her dress was simple, soft cotton, the color of faded lavender. It wasn't glamorous. It didn't shimmer under the light like the gowns the women in that restaurant often wore. It was, in fact, a dress that could easily be overlooked, except for how gracefully it hugged her frame and how effortlessly she carried herself in it. Adrian noticed her instantly, not because she was dazzling in the conventional sense, but because she seemed real, unpolished, like a piece of art that hadn't been framed yet. Her name was Emily Brooks. She had borrowed the dress from a thrift store just that afternoon, paying only $10. It was all she could afford after a week of juggling her job as a part-time waitress and caring for her younger brother. She almost hadn't come, feeling out of place at the thought of stepping into such a luxurious place. But her best friend had urged her to give this date a chance. "You deserve someone who sees you for you," her friend had said. When Adrian rose from his seat to greet her, Emily felt a wave of nervousness. The man in front of her was tall, handsome in a quiet way, his sharp suit and poised demeanor making him look like he belonged to another world. She half expected him to show disappointment at her modest appearance. But his eyes, calm, deep, and curious, held no trace of judgment. Instead, they sparkled with something unexpected: warmth. They sat down and the waiter brought the menus. Emily hesitated as she scanned the list of dishes, her heart sinking at the prices. She had never been in a place where a single appetizer cost more than her entire day's wage. Adrian noticed her discomfort. With a reassuring smile, he closed his own menu and said, "I'll order for us if that's okay. I know the chef here." The way he said it wasn't arrogant, more like an attempt to make things easier. Relieved, Emily nodded. Their conversation started with polite questions about work, hobbies, the usual. Emily spoke softly at first, wary of saying the wrong thing. But as minutes passed, Adrian realized she had a natural charm, the kind that didn't need to be rehearsed. She told him about growing up in a small town, about how she loved to paint sunsets but rarely had time for it anymore. She confessed she had never traveled far from her hometown, that the city still felt overwhelming to her. And she laughed an unguarded, melodic laugh when she shared how she once tripped in front of a bus while chasing her brother's runaway kite. Adrian found himself listening more intently than he had in years. He had attended dinners with investors, celebrities, and leaders, yet he couldn't recall feeling as captivated as he did listening to her talk about simple things. He was drawn not by her looks, though she was undeniably lovely in a quiet way, but by her authenticity. There was no pretense, no attempt to impress. She wasn't dazzled by his name, his wealth, or the world he came from. That was new for him, refreshing and strangely humbling. As the evening went on, Adrian asked about her dress. Emily blushed, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "It's nothing special," she said. "Just something I found at a thrift shop today. $10, actually." She laughed lightly, trying to play it off, but there was a trace of embarrassment in her voice. She wasn't used to being in a place where appearance often meant everything. Adrian leaned forward slightly, his expression sincere. "It suits you perfectly," he said. "You could wear anything and still outshine everyone in this room." He meant it, not as a practiced line, but as an honest observation. Emily's heart skipped a beat, not because of the compliment itself, but because of how genuine it felt. Outside, the city grew quieter as the night deepened. They lingered over dessert. chocolate mousse with raspberries, and Adrian noticed how Emily's eyes lit up at the first taste as if she were experiencing something rare and wonderful. It made him smile, seeing someone find joy in small things. When the dinner ended, Adrian insisted on walking her home. The streets were cool and the air smelled faintly of rain and autumn leaves. They talked more easily now, their steps falling into a natural rhythm. Emily told him about her brother, about her dream to someday open a little art studio where kids could come and paint without worrying about money. Adrian listened, silently admiring her selflessness. At the door of her modest apartment building, Emily hesitated. This was the part she usually dreaded, the awkward goodbye. But Adrian simply smiled, thanking her for the evening. "I hope we can do this again," he said, his tone soft but certain. Emily found herself smiling back, surprised at how much she wanted to see him again. In the days that followed, Adrian couldn't get Emily out of his mind. In his world of boardrooms and high-profile events, people often put on masks. Emily had none. That simplicity, that honesty, had touched something in him he hadn't realized was missing. He sent her a message the next morning, not a grand gesture, just a simple note. "Thank you for last night. I'd love to see you again." Emily read the message during her lunch break at the diner where she worked. For a moment she stared at it, her heart fluttering. She hadn't expected to hear from him so soon. Part of her still wondered if their worlds were too different, if someone like him could truly see her for who she was. But as she thought about his kind eyes and his quiet, genuine way of speaking, she decided to reply. Their second date wasn't at a fancy restaurant. Adrian, sensing her love for the simple and the real, invited her to a small cafe near the park. They sat by the window, watching the leaves drift down from the trees outside. They talked for hours, about books they loved, movies that made them cry, childhood memories, and the things they still wanted to do in life. Emily began to realize that behind the billionaire's composed exterior was a man who craved the same simple joys she did. Over the weeks, their connection deepened. Adrian introduced her to his world cautiously, never overwhelming her with its extravagance. He admired how she stayed true to herself, even as she walked through grand ballrooms and glittering parties. Emily, in turn, began to see that his wealth hadn't made him arrogant or distant. If anything, it had made him lonelier than she had imagined. She started to understand that what had drawn him to her was the very thing she had once thought was her weakness, her simplicity. One evening, months after their first meeting, Adrian confessed what he had felt that very night at the restaurant. "I knew I was in trouble the moment you walked in wearing that lavender dress," he said with a soft smile. "I'd seen countless women dressed in diamonds and designer gowns, but you came in wearing a $10 dress and I couldn't look away. I didn't see the dress." "I saw you," Emily laughed, her eyes shining. "I thought you'd judge me for it," she admitted. "I almost turned back at the door." Adrian shook his head. "That dress was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen, because it brought you to me." Their story wasn't a fairy tale in the conventional sense. There were challenges, differences in their backgrounds, the public scrutiny, Emily's initial doubts about whether she truly belonged in his world. But through it all, they kept choosing each other, drawn together not by appearances or wealth, but by something far more enduring, the simple, unshakable truth of genuine connection. Sometimes, in the quiet of the night, Emily would think back to that first evening, to the way she had walked into the restaurant feeling out of place and uncertain. She would smile, remembering how a $10 dress had led her to the man who would change her life. And Adrian, in turn, would often recall the moment he first saw her standing at the entrance, looking both nervous and radiant. He had fallen in love at first sight, not with her dress, but with the woman who wore it as if it were the most natural thing in the world.